Okay. Um, Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I thought we could just start off by just quickly introducing ourselves, especially since I think some of the names are off. So sorry about that. Raoul, maybe introduce yourself, please.
Sure, yeah, happy to be here. I had to sub in for somebody much more handsome. I do two things. I manage the relationship between the Aave protocol and Chainlink Labs, and I head our data go-to-market, so data feeds, data streams, and smart value recapture.
Hi everyone, my name is Mike. I'm founder and CEO of EtherFi. EtherFi is building a crypto neobank. So we've got a staking product, DeFi strategy vaults, and a credit card product that you can use to borrow and spend against your crypto.
Hey guys, Ben Rodriguez, Senior Protocol Specialist at Coinbase. You can consider me like a crypto native strategist at Coinbase. I work across all our different protocols and product lines, identifying unique opportunities for Coinbase to expand the product suite and stuff like that. This is very apt here because the thing that I've been working on this entire year has been staking, specifically staking ETF. So I'm very excited to talk about I'm just kind of related to that in this panel. But yeah, that's what I do there.
Hey guys, Ash Morgan from the Ethereum Foundation. Had a background in staking and then recently joined the Ethereum Foundation to manage, I guess, the RWA stablecoin efforts of institutions, their go-to-market, and then crypto enterprises trying to bring enterprise and institutional product to the traditional players.
Cool. Thank you so much. What we want to talk about today is the title is called Restaking at Scale, but really what it's about is the idea of compounding or composing assets so that assets on chain can be more productive and secure and underwrite a range of risks, whether it's started with vanilla staking and now expanding into a whole range of other financial and also network related security needs. So with that in mind, I'm just gonna launch into some questions, but feel free to jump in wherever. This is a question for Ben, Coinbase. Just generally with the US market access opening up, how are you seeing institutional capital engaging with these different yield opportunities? Staking, of course, being one of them. But are you seeing, in terms of healthier risk practices?
Yeah, it's a great question because think about institutions in general, right? We can't think about institutions as a monolith, right? There are different types of institutions. If you have more of a TradFi institution, whatever, especially if you think in the context of staking ETFs, which launched in the US, Grayscale about a month ago, right? Stake ETH, and why the entry queues were very high for and still very high. If you think about it, that they are very risk averse, so they take some time to truly understand every risk avenue of just staking in general before you even get to restaking. However, something that has been very true, and this was brought up in a previous panel, I believe, or the two panels before, was that people look at that yield that you get from staking, right? And they're like, okay, well, how can we maximize that somehow, right? And they think about that and they try to find some avenues. But the thing is, when they try to find those avenues, they have to conduct these risk vectors as well, right? So it's oh, well, what happens if we decide to, I don't know, add restaking to it? Okay, well, we know what the avenues are for ETHs, just plain staking ETH, right? It's you have the validator software that you need to run, that's a specific risk vector. The client software, that's a specific risk vector, right? The rewards, how they are generated, stuff like that. If you want to do some fun stuff with MEV, also a risk vector, right? And we went through an entire process of just education for just TradFi institutions, right? So then if we want to get to the idea of okay, well, how do we maximize productivity of our assets, right? Then we're going to have to think about, all right, well, what are the risk vectors there? This goes into what I with what I said about TradFi, right? The crypto native instos, right? They will more likely be able to experiment more, right? They still have a duty to whoever's giving them money and stuff like that, but they're able to experiment more. So when it comes to risk, right? I think that's the biggest name of the game here. It's like, how can we maximize yield, but also making sure that, we are not being very risky.
I'd love to throw that question to you as well, Mike, because you guys have recently started to or made announcements in this domain. So anything you can share on that front?
Yeah, so we, as EtherFi, with our staking product, we've been in conversations with basically all the major ETF issuers, and now starting, we've had actually some deployments across the various DATs, like SBET recently announced, and will soon be deploying into EtherFi. ETHZilla was actually the first, and then a couple of others that have been announced and are coming. So we kind of see the full spectrum. I would say on the DAT side, they have a lot more flexibility because that's an operating company, and then you have this sort of backdoor treasury policy that they can use to do all kinds of exotic things in DeFi. And in particular with ETHZilla, I mean, they are very DeFi native, so they're deploying into Aave, they're doing Pendle, they're using our assets in all kinds of creative ways. And then you have on the other side of the risk spectrum, SBET, which is doing much more kind of vanilla stuff in DeFi. And then on the kind of more extreme side, what we're seeing with the ETF issuers, even the concept of liquid staking, a liquid staking token was like going to Mars when they're trying to get to Miami, right? It's just a completely different universe, and I think there'll be a bit of time before we see the major ETFs participating in DeFi.
Cool, thanks. I wanted to ask Ash from Ethereum Foundation, as institutional participation grows, on the topic of like market infrastructure, what are the types of safeguards that like you're having discussions about that and learning is required in order to bring the next $1 billion on chain?
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I think there's 3 key points here. You've got like what exists, Ethereum in its current state. Institutions care to some degree at this point. More often than not, blockchains are just distribution mechanisms at this point. They're not really treated as like a security layer. And so, like, I think doubling down, tripling down on what's being built today matters. Like, our client diversity, the infrastructure that we built, just in general to secure Ethereum is what matters, and enabling institutions to understand why this infrastructure, the no vendor lock-in, the very neutral infrastructure that Ethereum is, that all these things need to be doubled down on and communicated. I think a growing trend is obviously, privacy in general, buzzwordy, but I think that in its current form, there's a lot of work to be done around compliance, privacy. The Ethereum Foundation, we have just built a new team, the institutional privacy team, and we are directly working with every major institution to frame and let them understand what the building blocks of privacy on chain look like. Often, private blockchains have been sold as the solution. Obviously, we know that a private blockchain is not private. Anyone on that network can see the ledger. And then finally, the most interesting point at the moment, I think, is insurance around and just traditional plain off-chain insurance for staking. You have very risk-adverse DATs, and I think the DAT sort of thing has brought about a big change in Ethereum's trajectory over the last sort of 6 months. We've seen that. It's coincided with a major narrative to commercialize Ethereum in general, and then the DAT piece has come about at a really sort of neat period, I guess. And so with those, you have an entity like BitMine, who today isn't staking, and would be willing to pay 50 to 100 basis points. I haven't spoken with Tom about this, but I'm sure would be willing to pay something of that nature. That's long Ethereum, basically the holders of that. So to take it to the next level to satisfy the JP Morgans, etc. I know we're eating away at the yield, but that in of itself I think is an interesting proposition. And I know we're working a little bit with them at the moment. They're doing some great stuff because they're looking at this opportunity around like correlated slashing risk. It's quite sophisticated that they've got their hands so far into it. And they've written, I think, anywhere from $40 to $60 million worth of cover. But, they're looking at the moment of, with entities coming to the table with $1 billion, type of policies, only looking at correlated slashing risk. So we're not looking yet at liquid staking and, any of the sort of systems built on top of the network. But yeah, I think that is something that we could shape and push the narrative a little more of. But yeah, it's an interesting time for those traditional insurers, an opportunity.
Yeah, like the topic of insurance, how complicated that is just, I find what's the fact that yield on chain and even from staking is now being derived from so many different sources. And so even if you looked at, I can't believe I'm saying traditional restaking, but like the original concept of staking, which is, taking staked ETH and using it to secure additional networks. Each of those networks comes with its own unique risk set. And now we have staked assets being used to underwrite or guarantee investment strategies, which is something that we're really excited about at Symbiotic. And then we also have, and this is sort of a build-up for a question for Chainlink, a stake that's securing other on-chain activities. And so Chainlink and Symbiotic, they recently collaborated with Lombard and with Solve to enhance the crypto economic guarantees for cross-chain transfers. And I would just love if you could unpack a little bit, like what's the significance of those announcements for the ecosystem, and just like what does this mean for the future of additional yield opportunities derived from staking?
Yeah, makes sense. The setup is basically that you can use something like staking, especially e-staking, to prove things that you can objectively set on chain, right? So you can, for example, prove that a message was passed or a message was not passed, but you can't prove like very vibey things in most cases. And in terms of Oracle messages, which ultimately like a bridge message is, it does make sense to put some stake on this because you can prove that somebody did not follow the rules in this particular case. Now, I think the reality of the situation is there's a lot more capital out there looking for yield than actual yield willing to pay for the capital. And one of the reasons for that is that I think pretty bluntly, the folks who earn the ETH staking yield are also permanently long ETH. Like it doesn't really make sense to hold ETH for yield because it's less than a risk-free rate. So like, hedging out the pricing volatility of ETH, you're not going to earn more than T-bills. So you would in most cases hold T-bills. And this is maybe immediately a question back to you guys. Do you see a future in which even folks who want to just earn just yield and not the actual price volatility, would they be coming on chain? Would it actually be an interesting thing for them to do restaking? Because you could theoretically construct systems that do restaking like things, like for example, fronting capital out of traditional financial assets, but we haven't really seen that. Is there something that restaking uniquely unlocks on chain? And is ETH then, for example, the right asset to do that with?
Yeah, I could talk from a couple perspectives on that one. Before we even, I know there's like a lot of like, institutions in general, like just across the board, from traditional to like mid-tier to crypto native institutions that just want to be able to put their capital on chain and earn yield on it through any which way that they potentially could think about. The thing is, in just with staking in general, like, we have the, better regulatory environment in the US, but it was still like, a long education process to be able to like help them understand all these things, right? Just in staking in general. Now we're going to add restaking to it. Again, like, we would go through and like, a whole education process on like, the risk vectors of restaking. What does it do to like, the risk of like, we're putting ETH at additional risk, how that look like, what's the risk profile of like, what are we underwriting? Like, if we're doing it for a network, like what's the risk vectors for that? But I want to take it back a little bit. I think there's a few things that we need to solve before we even think about putting, deploying more institutional capital on chain. This is what institutions are thinking about. It's mentioned privacy, right? Privacy, specifically that. Stable on-chain identity, and as mentioned also as well, insurance, right? All those three things that like, could, one of, like, the insurance could be actually solved with, like, restake and stuff like that. But, those combination of things and understanding those things and these like primitives existing first is probably what needs to happen before we think about, like, adding more, like, to the idea of, like, let's do, like, put all capital on chain and
Just like shifting gears a little bit, because the topic here is institutions, and honestly, that could mean a whole range of things and nothing at the same time. So I push back on that description as well. But let's just look at it from the perspective of really the investor, the supply side for the staking context, or the yield seeker, and the fact that there seems to be like a growing comparison and decision between stablecoin denominated and derived yields and yield from like more crypto assets, specifically ETH or LSTs, or even the early efforts for Bitcoin related staking yield. And I'm just curious, like, what are some of, like, if you guys could unpack for the audience, like, what are some of the levers that are used to compare staking yield versus like tokenized RWA or like T-bill related yield? Like, what do those conversations look like with these investors or institutions? And like, are there ways where these two like yield strategies can converge? Whether it's like staking ETH to underwrite RWA strategies, which we are seeing happen. Is that going to stay niche? Just like, you guys could unpack like how those two different yield strategies compare and contrast and converge.
Mind if I first take that?
Please.
So I think what we saw in DeFi in the beginning was this idea that you would have crypto tokens, they would get listed in Aave, and you would take loans on them. That wasn't that good of an idea, and it mostly kind of died out after Aave v2, because you're underwriting these super risky forms of collateral, and you need people who have a very strong opinion on the price. Like, I believe that this particular token is going to go up, and therefore I'm going to hold it and do something with it. The thing that really made DeFi take off is delta neutral yields, or like, I'm willing to take the risk on the ETH price anyway, I want to earn something on top of that. Or I'm willing to take the risk on $1 and I'm willing to earn something on top of that. Terra Luna was just that. Everybody was farming 20% yield in Anchor because it was just dollar denominated yield. And now as well, you see something like 70 to 80% of the TVL in Aave is in PT tokens and in USDE. It's looping. It's all just earning delta neutral revenue. And I think the reality is with something like staked ETH today, and basically any LRT, since it doesn't go above the risk-free rate plus hedging costs, it doesn't yet play into that game really. Like, it doesn't play into the dollar yield because most institutions are not yet comfortable taking the staking yield or the ETH pricing risk. Somebody like a DAT is, because that's literally their job. Like, if you're SharpLink, if you're Bitmine, whatever, your job is holding ETH and then you want to squeeze out a couple more bits. But if you are a BlackRock and you manage trillions of dollars, your job is earning dollar-denominated yields, and you can't effectively offset the risk of the ETH price going up or down. So I feel like unless these rates sort of converge to at least some degree, it's going to be very difficult to get trillions of dollars into volatile asset staking strategies because they just can't afford it compared to even just holding T-bills at this point. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are fundamentally different things. I'll make a couple points. One, the large participants today in DeFi that loosely would very loosely would call institutional, which are hedge funds, high net worth individuals that are large enough to be almost considered institutions. They are actually able to generate much more than T-bill yields just by being completely delta neutral running ETH strategies. A very large trade is just leverage staking on Aave. So someone deposits, these days mostly wrapped ETH, so the ETH staking asset, they borrow ETH at 2%, they're earning, let's say 3.5%. They loop that 10 times, and now you're getting 15% yield on dollar denominated yield. That's a very popular trade. It's kind of gone up and down. Now that's not something that a BlackRock or Fidelity is ever going to do. But if someone is comfortable, being long ETH, that's I do see eventually institutions getting comfortable with that. The other thing I'll say is, T-bill, like risk-free yield on dollars versus staking yield are like wildly different things. T-bill is you're lending money to the U.S. government, who has the ability to print dollars, and so you have a lot of trust that they're probably going to pay their debts. Staking yield was never meant to be, and the Ethereum position, I think, is that actually is it was never meant to be like a risk-free yield. It's not a risk-free yield. You're staking, you're putting your ETH at stake to secure the network, and it was never meant to be that 90% of ETH is staked. It was supposed to be a relatively small thing to decentralize the network. Whereas liquid staking tokens, really from the beginning, were almost a bit of a hack on the system. They weren't intended. There's a reason they wasn't designed into the protocol. So I think at some point that might there may be a change. In fact, there's been lots of discussion around changing the staking yield curve so that it starts to discourage excessive amounts being staked. So it's just these are radically different things, and it's important to understand that so that we don't think, 5 years from now, all ETH is staked and everyone's earning this 3%. Like that's not going to be the case. If we ever get to that point, probably the issuance curve will be changed to prevent that kind of behavior. So they're not really comparable.
Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I wonder if the Ethereum.
Yeah, well, if the researchers had anything to do with it, I think the staking rewards would go quickly to zero, which we wouldn't enjoy. But
We have tough conversations with a lot of people.
Yeah, some really, really tough conversations. I think, Mike, you hit the nail on the head, right? They're completely separate things. Although, like the abstract analogy, right? Like the government writes the debt, the banks distribute that, and then if the banks fail, the central bank gets involved and prints a bit more money. And so I think like that whole network is a security layer backed by a military, and then Ethereum ultimately just at the high level is like a analogous to America. It's an asset storage zone and a protected zone. And so like Ethereum at large is one of these things that is a state. It is able to store assets, and I think like that's ultimately long run. We scale to hundreds of trillions. It's target $100 trillion dollars worth of value on Ethereum stored, and like we get a lot of value from that alone, I guess. And the asset is pricing security ultimately, and I think that is probably a narrative that isn't clear and isn't defined, and it's hard to price. It's not discounted cash flow. It's security, and therefore you're looking at this asset through a completely different lens. If you're investing in DATs, if you're purchasing and long holding ETH, and the yield on top of the ETH, that's a bonus. I see it from that lens, and that's probably more the communication that we need to go down. It's like getting Facebook early days and getting a dividend, but compounding that dividend in Facebook. So like that framing, I guess it's not as palatable if we're looking at it as a financial product, but that's sort of how I go about it.
Just seeing the time, and there's still a couple other questions that I wanted to get to, but narrow it down to two. One that I wanted to speak to as well is about, again, like not necessarily institutions, but I think the institutional conversation is a proxy for just broader access to crypto for, the non-crypto native market, which is 99% of the world. So on that note, I wanted to ask you, Mike, about the EtherFi card, and about, whether, without sharing too much of a roadmap, but just like big picture, you envision, whether it's the EtherFi card or products similar to that as being further access points into DeFi or staking, and bringing it back to some of the things that we're talking about here. Like what could that look like?
Great product, by the way. Use it every day.
Yeah, sign up at ether.fi. The vision of creating this crypto native neobank that EtherFi is on was actually there really from day one. And the reason, very personally, is this is something that just I wanted to exist. I really wanted a product that would allow me to get off of my TradFi banks and just use crypto day to day in real life. And so we view this as EtherFi as like this is kind of like the end game of DeFi. What does it look like to actually replace traditional finance, or at least from the standpoint of personal, consumer banking, with DeFi rails. And so the credit card, you can see even one step beyond that, which is like a pure crypto rails, payment system that replaces, Visa, MasterCard, Amex networks. But I think step one was very obviously, look, you have to plug into people's day-to-day lives. You can't have something that is, requires you to sign random hex transactions and remember seed phrases and, get rugged if you sign the wrong thing. You can't have that. Like, it really just needs to feel like you're not trading anything off when you're using a crypto native neobank versus something like a Revolut. And so for sure, my hope is that EtherFi ultimately opens up access to crypto to a much broader range of users.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. I'd love to just give each person, or except for Mike, because you just got to say something, but you're allowed to if you want. But yeah, like we're sitting back here a year from now, like what would the topic of this panel be in here if it was not this? Or just like hot take for 2026?
I think what I'm going to be looking at most for 2026 is, as a lot more of the TradFi yield comes on chain, which tends to pay like 7-8%, will the restaking loops stay just as big, and how will they keep that going? To, for example, something like a pendle loop on EtherFi.
Give me 20% on Polymarket, but I think like a BlackRock will probably force the hand of their customer base of like a pretty big product, an existing product, maybe $20-30 billion product, and just say, find your custody provider. Like, we're taking this on chain as an experiment, and one that they're leaning into Larry's big push. So that would be something that will unlock a big landslide, I think.
Expansion of goals, like managed strategies, right? Like taking what Mike just said about like just getting being able to just use something, put everything on DeFi, or just like abstract that experience, because like for some reason we just keep building crypto native products for crypto natives and not for the 99% we were just talking about. So take what Mike's doing, right, and EtherFi and other other folks that are trying to do that for the consumer case. Bring that up to institutions, manage strategies. Here's a pile of money, right? Do something with it, and makes it simple and abstracted interface. So that's what I think we'll be talking about next year.
Pile of money. That note, did you want to add anything, or you?
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say is I genuinely think that we've had a huge meta around stablecoins, but stablecoins are a tool to do what? Well, I think we're now starting to see the emergence of this crypto neobank meta, lots of new players entering the space, which is great. I really think once one of those crosses 10, 20 million users, that will be a bit of a watershed moment that hopefully in the broader kind of general public, people will look at crypto as like, hey, this is actually something useful, not this like great, casino in the sky.
Cool. Well, that's all the time we have, guys. Thank you so much. Thus ends our panel.
Thank you.